The single tomato was a perfect, defiant red against the dusty green of its vine. Lynn knelt in the dark soil of her garden, the hem of her worn dress gray with dust, and felt a stillness settle in her chest. It was the first of the season, a globe of flawless crimson she had coaxed from the stubborn Wyoming soil. Here, in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains, everything was a fight. The wind fought the shingles on her roof, the sun fought the moisture in the ground, and the silence fought a person's sanity. But this tomato, this small, weighty promise of a harvest, was a victory. Her cabin stood a quarter-mile from the sprawling ranch where Silas Blackwood worked. It was a simple, sturdy structure her late husband Chen had built with his own hands before the railroad work took him for good. The deed to their 40 acres, filed properly in Cheyenne and tucked inside a tin box beneath a floorboard, was her only claim to a place in the world. For 2 years she had held on. She woke before the sun, her hands already reaching for the familiar weight of the axe or the handle of the water bucket. She tended her garden, mended her clothes, and traded her surplus vegetables in the small town of Jericho, 10 miles east, for flour and salt. She was a fixed point in the landscape, as constant and quiet as the mountains themselves. Silas Blackwood often watched her from the fence line that separated his employer's vast cattle operation from her small, fiercely defended square of the world. He never stared, not in a way that felt possessive or intrusive. His gaze was one of quiet astonishment. He saw her chop wood with a steady, rhythmic swing that would tire men twice her size. He saw her patch her own roof after a hailstorm, her small figure resolute against the sky. He had, on more than one occasion, found a reason to ride the fence near her property, leaving a sack of oats or a freshly dressed rabbit on a post for her to find. No words were ever exchanged in these offerings. There was only the quiet gift and its quiet acceptance, an unspoken language of survival in a land that demanded it. Today, however, was different. As Silas sat his bay mare, watching Lynn in her garden, he saw the tracks. 2 sets. One was her own, small, moccasin-clad footprint. The other was the sharp, clean print of a city boot, accompanied by the hoof marks of a shod horse. A fine-limbed animal, unlike the sturdy ranch horses of the valley. The tracks led from the main road directly to her cabin door and back out again. They were fresh. A cold knot formed in Silas's gut. Company was rare in this part of the territory, and the kind of man who wore expensive boots and rode a blooded horse was rarely company a person wanted. He urged his mare forward, not toward Lynn, but along the fence, his eyes scanning the ground. He was a man of few words, his thoughts as spare and weathered as the landscape, but the sight of those tracks stirred something protective in him, something that felt dangerously close to ownership. Lynn was capable, he knew that better than anyone. He'd seen her face down a cornered badger with a shovel and a look of grim determination. But the world was full of dangers worse than badgers, dangers that came smiling, with papers in their pockets and lies on their tongues. Lynn heard the soft clopping of his horse and finally looked up from her tomato. She shielded her eyes against the morning sun, her face, usually a mask of serene composure, showing a flicker of something else. Worry. Silas pulled his horse to a stop at the rickety gate to her yard. "Mornin', Lynn," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Silas," she replied, her voice soft but clear.
She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands onto her apron. "It is a good morning for the garden." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the boot prints near her porch steps. "Had a visitor?" She followed his eyes, and the small smile that had touched her lips vanished. "A man from the east, a Mr. Sterling. He is buying land." "He make you an offer?" Silas asked, keeping his voice even, though the knot in his stomach tightened. "He did," she said. "He was very polite. He said a woman alone has no business with so much land." She looked at her 40 acres, a parcel that would be a rounding error on the massive ranch he worked for, and a spark of defiance lit her eyes. "He does not understand what it means to build a home." Silas understood. He saw the neat rows of corn, the sturdy cabin, the well-kept chicken coop. This wasn't just land, it was a life, wrested from nothing. "What did you tell him?" "I told him my home is not for sale," she said simply.
Silas nodded again. a slow, deliberate motion. That was the right answer. But he knew men like Sterling. They didn't hear the word no. They only heard a temporary inconvenience. He looked from her tired, resolute face to the perfect red tomato gleaming on the vine. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the fight for this small piece of earth had just begun. The next week, the creek went dry. It wasn't a slow dwindling, the way it did in the driest parts of August. It was an abrupt absence. One morning, Lynn went to fill her buckets from the small, clear stream that bisected her property, the very reason Chen had chosen this spot, and found only a muddy trickle seeping between the rocks. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Without that water, her garden would wither in a matter of days. Her chickens, her hopes, everything would turn to dust. She followed the creek bed upstream, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A half-mile onto the next parcel, the one she knew had recently been purchased, she found the cause. A crude dam of rock and felled timber choked the waterway, diverting the entire flow into a newly dug ditch that led west, away from her land. It was no act of nature. The saw marks on the logs were fresh, the displaced earth still dark and damp. When Silas rode by that evening on his way back to the ranch house, he found her standing by the dead stream, her shoulders slumped. The defiant spark he'd seen a week ago was gone, replaced by a look of utter desolation. He didn't need to ask. He could see the dust already settling on the leaves of her corn stalks. "Sterling," he said. It wasn't a question. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the dry creek bed, as if she could will the water back into it. "This is his answer to your no," Silas said, his voice grim. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in the heavy silence. "He can't do this. There are water rights." "He is a rich man. I am not," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The law is for men like him." "Sometimes," Silas allowed, kicking at a loose stone, "but sometimes the law is just the law, and it's on your side." He looked at her, truly looked at the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, even in defeat. "We'll go to Jericho, tomorrow." The thought of it terrified her. Jericho was a place of averted eyes and muttered comments, a place where she was an oddity, a curiosity. But the sight of her wilting garden was more terrifying still. "We?" she asked, the word sounding foreign. "We," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "You won't face this alone." The trip to Jericho was tense. Lynn sat beside Silas on the wagon bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every pair of eyes they passed on the dusty main street felt like a judgment. Sterling was already there, holding court in front of the land office, a group of ranchers and townsfolk gathered around him. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, even in the summer heat, a picture of East Coast money and influence. "A necessary improvement," he was saying, his voice smooth and reasonable, "to ensure the most efficient use of this valley's resources for the good of all." "My resources are being diverted from my land," Lynn said, her voice shaking but clear as she and Silas stepped into the circle. All heads turned. A murmur went through the crowd. Sterling's pleasant expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Ah, the widow. I was just explaining the benefits of progress." "You've dammed her creek, Sterling," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. He wasn't a large man, but he had a stillness about him that commanded attention. "That's not progress. That's theft." Sterling laughed, a condescending sound. "My good man, I have a legal right to the water on my property. It's all there in the territorial statutes. Perhaps you should learn to read them before making such baseless accusations." It was the wrong thing to say. Silas stepped forward and took the legal notice Sterling had tacked to the land office door. The crowd fell silent, expecting a confrontation. They knew Silas Blackwood as a quiet hand, good with horses, but not a man of letters. They were wrong. His finger traced the dense print. "It says here," Silas read aloud, his voice steady, "that any diversion of a natural waterway requires a 30-day public notice of intent, and that any prior downstream claims, established before the date of this notice, must be honored." He looked up from the paper, his eyes locking with Sterling's. "This notice is dated yesterday. Lynn's claim is 2 years old. You broke the law, Sterling. You didn't just break it, you bragged about it. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of confident authority, turned a blotchy red. He had underestimated the quiet cowboy, and he had done it in public. The ranchers, men who lived and died by water rights and the principle of a man's word, began to look at Sterling with new eyes. They looked at the small Chinese woman standing beside Silas, not with pity, but with a dawning respect. She had held her ground, and she had not been alone. The territorial agent, a harried man named Peters, cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwood is correct, Sterling. You'll have that dam down by sundown, or I'll have the marshal ride out. Sterling snatched the paper from Silas's hand, his face a thunderous mask. He glared at Lynn, a look of pure venom that promised this was not over. It was only a temporary victory, Silas knew. Sterling was a man who wouldn't forgive a public humiliation. He had been beaten by a simple truth, spoken plainly. But a man like that didn't fight with truth. He fought with money and power, and he had plenty of both. The water would flow again tomorrow. The real trouble, however, was just getting started. The dam came down, and the water returned. For a few weeks, an uneasy peace settled over the valley. Lynn's garden recovered, the plants seeming to drink in the sunlight and water with a desperate thirst. She and Silas fell into a new rhythm. He would stop by her cabin most evenings, no longer leaving gifts on the fence post, but bringing them to her door. He'd help her mend a broken hinge or sharpen her axe, his quiet presence a comforting fixture in her solitary life. They spoke little, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a burgeoning trust that felt more solid than any words. But the shadow of Sterling lingered. He was no longer seen in Jericho, but Silas knew he hadn't left the territory. A man with that much pride and that much money didn't simply walk away from a loss. He regrouped. He found new weapons. The letter arrived by way of the circuit rider, a thin, travel-stained envelope addressed to Lynn in a precise, elegant hand. It was from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the meaning was clear. A formal challenge had been filed against her homestead claim. The petitioner, a Mr. Alistair Sterling, alleged that the original survey markers were fraudulent and that the claim had not been continuously worked as required by law. A hearing was set for 1 month's time. If she could not prove her title, the land would revert to the territory to be sold at public auction. The paper slipped from her fingers. This was a blow she could not counter with a shovel or a steady hand. This was a war of papers and signatures, a world she did not understand. The allegation that she hadn't worked the land was a cruel joke. She had poured her sweat and tears into every square inch of it. The accusation of fraud felt like a stain on Chen's memory. That night the sky broke open. A summer thunderstorm, violent and sudden, swept down from the mountains. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin like a hungry animal. Lynn sat at her small table, the legal notice spread before her in the flickering lamplight, and felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. It could only be one person. She unlatched the door, and Silas stood on her porch, soaked to the skin, his hat dripping in his hand. "Saw the light," he said, as if that explained everything. "Figured you'd be worried about the storm." She stepped back, letting him in. He brought the scent of rain and wet earth with him, filling the small, tense space. He saw the letter on the table, saw the look on her face, and needed no explanation. He picked up the document, his brow furrowed as he read. "He's a snake, this one," Silas said, his voice low. "He can't beat you on the water, so he'll try to steal the ground out from under you." He looked around the cabin, at the neatly stacked firewood, the clean-swept floor, the row of preserved vegetables in glass jars on a shelf. "Not continuously worked? A blind man can see the work you've done here." "Chen made the survey," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He would never. He was an honest man." "I know," Silas said gently. He moved closer, his presence a solid wall against the storm raging outside and the one raging within her. "But we have to prove it." She shook her head, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the faint layer of dust on her cheek. "How, Silas? All I have is my word. And what is my word against a man like him? She reached for the tin box beneath the floorboards and brought it to the table. Inside was the deed, a few worn Chinese coins, and a small, crudely carved wooden bird. She picked up the bird, its surface smoothed by years of handling. "Chen made this for me," she said, her voice cracking, "on the ship from our homeland. He said it was a bird of good fortune. He said it would watch over our new home." She looked up at Silas, her eyes shimmering with a pain he was only just beginning to understand. "He died laying track for the railroad. He worked until his heart gave out, saving every dollar for this piece of ground. This land is all I have left of him." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Silas reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the wooden bird from her palm. He studied the simple, loving cuts of the knife. He wasn't just fighting for a neighbor anymore. He was fighting for Chen's memory, for the hope that had been carved into this small piece of wood. "My father lost our farm back in Missouri," he said, his voice quiet, the words coming hard, as if pulled from a deep well. "To a man just like Sterling, a man with a long coat and a short memory for his debts. He used papers and laws we didn't understand." He smiled while he did it. "I was 16. I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone again if I could help it." He placed the bird back in her hand, and his calloused fingers closed around hers. The touch was electric, a current of shared loss and quiet strength. The storm outside seemed to fade, the world shrinking to the small circle of lamplight, to the warmth of his hand covering hers. "We will fight him, Lynn," he said, his gaze intense. "We will find a way." She looked at him, at the sincerity in his tired eyes, at the way his hand felt so right holding hers. For the first time since Chen's death, she did not feel utterly alone. She leaned in, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He met her halfway. The kiss was not born of passion, but of something deeper. It was hesitant, gentle, a taste of rain and salt, and the promise of standing together against the storm. It was a quiet acknowledgement that their two solitary paths had now, irrevocably, become one. When they broke apart, the fear was still there, but it no longer had the same power. It was a dragon they would face together. The month that followed was a blur of frantic activity. Silas took 2 weeks' wages from his savings and rode for Cheyenne, a long and grueling 4-day journey each way. He spent his time in the dusty archives of the Territorial Land Office, poring over old survey maps and railroad right-of-way grants. He was searching for a ghost, an echo of Chen's original claim that would stand up in court. Back at the cabin, Lynn worked with a ferocity born of desperation. She harvested every vegetable, canned every fruit, and mended every stitch of clothing, as if she could physically armor her home against the legal assault with sheer hard work. The day of the hearing arrived, a blisteringly hot morning that promised no relief. Lynn and Silas rode into Jericho, this time not in the wagon, but on horseback, side by side. The town felt different. The story of the dam and Silas's public reading of the statute had circulated. The story of Sterling's legal challenge had followed. The valley had chosen its side. As they dismounted in front of the makeshift courthouse, the blacksmith nodded at them from his doorway. The mercantile owner's wife gave Lynn a small, encouraging smile. Sterling was already inside, flanked by a lawyer from Cheyenne in a suit even finer than his own. They exuded an aura of expensive, unshakable confidence. The hearing was presided over by Judge Miller, an old, weathered man known for his stern demeanor and his intolerance for foolishness. Sterling's lawyer laid out their case with practiced ease. He produced documents suggesting the creek's path had been different when the original territory was surveyed, implying Chin had knowingly filed on a more valuable plot than he was entitled to. He called a witness, a surveyor he had hired, who testified that the corner markers seemed newer than they should. It was a web of half-truths and expertly crafted doubt, designed to overwhelm and confuse. When it was Lynn's turn, she stood, her hands trembling slightly. She spoke in her quiet, clear voice, telling the judge about her husband, about their dream, about the work she had done. It was heartfelt, but she knew it was not the kind of evidence that held up in a court. "Do you have any proof to counter these claims?" Judge Miller asked, his expression unreadable. Before Lynn could answer, Silas stood up. "Your Honor, we do." He unrolled a long, brittle piece of paper on the table. This is a Union Pacific Railroad survey map from 1868. I found it in the Cheyenne archives, misfiled under Transportation Infrastructure. He pointed to a section of the map. It shows this valley, and it clearly marks this creek, which they called Red Rock Stream. And right here, his finger jabbed at a small hand-drawn square, is a notation. Liang's plot, with the exact same boundaries as Mrs. Chen's current deed. A murmur went through the courtroom. Sterling's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor, that's not a legal survey." "No," Silas agreed calmly. "It's better. It's a third-party record made by the railroad's own surveyors 4 years before this territory was even fully organized. They were marking potential homesteads for their workers. It proves that Chen didn't invent these boundaries. He filed on a plot that was already recognized." He then turned to Lin. "Mrs. Chen's husband's family name was Liang. He took the name Chen when he became a citizen. This is his land." The pieces clicked into place with an audible thud. The proof was undeniable, not written in the elegant script of a lawyer, but in the practical hand of a railroad surveyor. It was a truth written in dirt and ink, older and more solid than Sterling's manufactured claims. Judge Miller studied the map, then looked at Sterling, his eyes like chips of ice. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice dangerously low, "it appears you have brought a frivolous and malicious claim before this court. You have wasted this court's time and harassed a law-abiding citizen." He banged his gavel once, the sound cracking through the silent room. "Claim dismissed, and you, sir, will pay all of Mrs. Chen's legal fees and a punitive fine of $500 to the court for this stunt." Sterling's face was a study in disbelief, which quickly curdled into pure rage. His empire of paper had crumbled against a single, inconvenient fact. He and his lawyer stalked from the courthouse without a word, the hostile stares of the townspeople following them out. Outside, in the bright, unforgiving sunlight, Lin felt a wave of dizziness. It was over. She had won. She looked at Silas, who was quietly rolling up the precious map. He had not done it for her. He had done it with her. They rode home in a comfortable silence, the weight of the last month lifted from their shoulders. As they reached her gate, Silas dismounted and stood, waiting. She slid down from her horse, her legs unsteady. They walked into the garden, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. The plants were heavy with fruit, the air thick with the scent of ripe tomatoes and rich earth. It was a testament to her resilience, a living, breathing victory. Silas stopped by the vine where the first tomato had grown. It was laden with them now, dozens of perfect red globes. He reached out and plucked one, its skin warm from the sun. He turned it over in his calloused hands. "You've built something amazing here, Lin," he said, his voice full of a quiet awe. He looked from the garden to her, his gaze soft. "Whoever marries you will be a lucky man." A small, genuine smile touched her lips, a smile that reached her eyes and made them shine. She stepped closer to him, into his space, and the world seemed to hold its breath. She looked up at him, her heart a steady, certain rhythm in her chest. "I was hoping it would be you," she whispered. He didn't answer with words. He simply reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, and lowered his head to hers. The kiss, this time, was not about shared hardship or fighting dragons. It was about the quiet, certain joy of a harvest finally brought home. It was the start of a new season, a life to be built not in solitude, but together, on a small patch of earth they could finally, truly call their own. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.